certain sadness hangs over the fort today. Its once splendid buildings lie in ruins, covered with the overgrowth of history. And yet, this fort had an exciting past. It provided the majestic backdrop to a dramatic conflict between a sultan and a saint. The Tughlakabad Fort was built in the 14th century by the Sultan Ghiasuddin Tughlak. He'd occupied the throne of Delhi soon after the death of Sultan Alauddin Khilji. During the reign of Sultan Ghiasuddin Tughlak, there lived in Delhi the great Sufi saint of the Chishtiya order, Hazrat Nizamuddin Auliya. Sheikh Nizamuddin preached the doctrine of love and of compassion. It combined elements of Hinduism, Buddhism and Christianity with Islam. It's no wonder that he was extremely popular with the people of Delhi. The arrogant Sultan Ghiasuddin had little use for the teachings of Hazrat Nizamuddin, nor did he like the saint's popularity. The story goes that when Ghiasuddin ordered the construction of the Tughlakabad Fort, Nizamuddin was building a bawli or tank for use by the thirsty pilgrims who used to throng to him to seek his blessings. The Sultan commandeered all the masons to complete the royal fort and would not spare even a few labourers to work on the Sufis' well. However, the workers were so devoted to the saint that they toiled on the bawli at night after their day's labour on the fort. Ghiasuddin issued a proclamation banning traders from selling oil to Nizamuddin. He wanted to prevent lamps from being lit around the bawli and thus stop work from being carried out at night. This problem too was solved by another fakir, Sheikh Nasiruddin, who was one of Nizamuddin's disciples. It's said that even lamps filled with water by Nasiruddin miraculously lit up and provided enough light for the bawli to be dug. The Sufis' bawli exists till today in the heart of the area known as Hazrat Nizamuddin. Sheikh Nasiruddin too has an area of Delhi named after him. On account of the miracle of the lamps, Sheikh Nasiruddin got known as Roshan Chirag-e-Dilli, or the bright lamp of Delhi. The area where his shrine exists is still called Chirag Dilli. In any event, Hazrat Nizamuddin Auliya was so annoyed by Sultan Ghiasuddin that he is said to have cursed the Tughlakabad Fort.
Ya rahe ujjar, ya base gujjar.
It'll either remain uninhabited or wild Gujjars will populate it. Just 5 years after the fort was built, Ghiasuddin died. Tughlakabad was abandoned. It was populated for centuries only by herds of cattle owned by the local pastoral Gujjars. There's another interesting story about how Ghiasuddin met his end. It's said that when the Sultan was in Bengal on a military campaign, he got more and more annoyed as reports reached him of Sheikh Nizamuddin's growing popularity. The Sultan announced his intention of returning to Delhi to tackle the saint. When Nizamuddin was informed of this, he is supposed to have said, Hunuz Dilli Durast. Delhi is still far away. As it happened, when the Sultan was nearing Delhi, he was greeted by his son, who directed a massive arch of welcome. And precisely when Papa Dear was under the arch, and the son was not, the arch came tumbling down. Ghiasuddin died and lies buried here in the tomb that he'd built for himself. His son, Muhammad bin Tughlak, became the Sultan. Muhammad bin Tughlak too built a city in Delhi. He called it Jahanpanah, the refuge of the world. As today's travelers Muhammad bin Tughlak's capital, they can hardly imagine that they are spanning 600 years from the present to the past. The Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta, who came to India in the 14th century, described vividly the splendours of Jahanpanah. The centerpiece of the city was the multi-domed Begumpuri Mosque. Not much remains of Muhammad bin Tughlak's grand refuge of the world. It's visited only by some who occasionally come to pray. And there are others who come just to play. And yet there's something that survives from those times. These succulent kebabs which delight the palates of Delhiites today owe their origins to the period around that of the Tughlaks. This style of cooking reached its zenith under the Grand Mughals later.
मुग़ल खाने की खासियत यह है कि इसमें दूध, दही और घी का इस्तेमाल ज़्यादा होता है, क्योंकि मुग़ल जो थे वो लड़ाकू लोग थे, तो इसलिए उनको हर वक्त ताकत की ज़रूरत होती थी। तो इसलिए उनके जितने भी खाने हैं उसके अंदर दूध, दही और घी का ज़्यादा इस्तेमाल होता है।
The rough and ready roasted meats preferred by warriors were turned into elaborate curries in more settled times. Meanwhile, Delhi saw unsettled times. Muhammad bin Tughlak decided to shift his capital to Deogiri in the Deccan. This move's been portrayed as the irrational action of a capricious monarch. The shifting of the capital made a great deal of sense. Delhi was constantly threatened by the Mongol hordes who descended on it after crossing the mountainous passes and the plains of Punjab. Deogiri, which was renamed Daulatabad, was a safer site. A concept of India was emerging, and Daulatabad was almost at its geographical center. The fort at Daulatabad, originally built by the Yadava rulers, was attractive in another way. It provided the state-of-the-art defense measures of the times. Nevertheless, Delhiwalas, who've always loved their city, resented the move. They tried to resist it in many ways. But even when they failed in the face of the arrogant Sultan, he in turn was beaten by ecology. There just wasn't enough water around Daulatabad to sustain a capital. Soon after the court had been established there, the weary citizens were ordered to make their long journey back to Delhi once again. The Adilabad fort, built by Muhammad bin Tughlak in the vicinity of his father's tomb, flourished. Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlak made many other radical moves. Every time you handle a currency note, spare a thought for Muhammad bin Tughlak. It was that monarch, far ahead of his times, who launched token currency in India. He'd learnt of the experiment in China, and at least in that respect, he sought to globalize India. Muhammad bin Tughlak failed in popularizing token currency. The intrinsic value of precious metals like gold continued to fascinate Indians in his time, as it does even today. Muhammad bin Tughlak faced failure in another respect too. He took on the Islamic clergy by restricting the influence of the ulema to the mosques. He did not want the clergy to interfere in affairs of state, but the mosque and the state could not be kept totally segregated. It was perhaps too early to affirm the principles of secularism. The historically precocious monarch was largely unsuccessful in his attempts, but he did succeed in establishing a concept of India with a distinctive civilization and with Delhi as its most important city.
The history that is written, the contemporary history of Muhammad bin Tughlak, is not a record of facts. It is a charge sheet against the ruler. So all the events are described not in a chronological order, but in accordance with the enormity of the crime or offence in the eyes of the contemporary historian. Why this bias? He tried to bring about a complete radical change in the social structure and tried to empower the poor. This is something which is quite obvious because Ziauddin Barni, the contemporary historian, gives a list that such a potter, a cobbler, a tailor, a scavenger, they are governors, they are officers and this and that. What is happening? He says that this means that the world is coming to an end.
Muhammad bin Tughlak was ahead of his times, but then in India, time is not unilinear. In Delhi itself, the present is always contiguous with the past. Just a span away from a busy carriageway, a village continues to exist comfortably in another era more than 600 years back in time. In this village nestles another mosque known as the Khirki Masjid on account of the many windows or khirkis that adorn it. The architecture of the mosque is both grand and reflective of the turbulent times in which it was built. It's a wonderful place even now, though a little dark and eerie inside, deserted by its congregation, but much favored by bats. History lives on in the dargah of Hazrat Nizamuddin Auliya. Among his followers was Amir Khusro, the poet and historian who saw and chronicled several regimes in Delhi. Amir Khusro is credited with the invention of the sitar. Khusro is also said to have invented the Hindavi language, a creative mixture of Sanskrit, Persian and Arabic. The poet wrote in the language of the common people, of love and of the joy of life. The mausoleums of the saint and the poet continue to attract a wide variety of visitors. In the end, the saint and the poet outlived the sultans. Centuries after their time, Nizamuddin and Amir Khusro tower in spirit over Delhi, as much its cultural icons as the Qutub Minar.
والله الذي لا إله إلا هو عالم الغيب والشهادة هو الرحمن الرحيم هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر
With the second largest population of Muslims in the world, India is as Islamic a country as any other. Conventional wisdom has it that Islam first came to India with the conquest of Sindh by Muhammad bin Qasim in the early 8th century. Ironically, both North Indian historians and their Pakistani counterparts subscribe to this theory. The fact is that the oldest mosque in India was built on this site in Kerala. Even before the advent of Islam, the Arabs had established several trading settlements along the Malabar coast. After the Arabs had converted to Islam, their faith was imported into India along with their merchandise. Dissimilar cargoes, brought in aboard seafaring dhows of the kind that are still made today in this region. The Arabian trading communities gradually established themselves and their religion. The Muslim community on the Malabar coast, the result of a marriage between the Arabs and the local population, are called the Moplas. The term is derived from Mapila, meaning bridegroom or child. The echoes of the Arab influence on the culture of the Moplas can be heard in the music of A.R. Rahman. These continuities like this that make up India's cultural mix. The very name India is derived from the name of the river Sindhu or Indus. The West at various points of time referred to the land as Ind, India or Hindustan. The Sindhu river has also given its name to the region that forms its most important hinterland, Sindh. A century after Islam arrived on the Malabar coast, another wave of Islam reached Sindh and in due course spread from there to other parts of the subcontinent. Around the same time, Islam was also taking root in different areas of the world, and its effects varied from region to region.
Kosambi comments on the spread of Islam barely 100 years after the Prophet's death. Islam spread from Europe to Asia. In Europe, it liberated the peasants from exactions of the church and of the kings. In Persia, it liberated the peasants again from exactions of the kings and the nobles. In India, Kosambi compares the coming of Islam with the coming of the Aryans and says that Islam brought in new technology and freed forces of production. This is not exactly true, because while the Aryans brought huge areas under the plough, Islam did not do so. What the Muslims did was they brought in a lot of technology. They brought in Chinese porcelain, tea, silk, gunpowder, but they did not really change the forces of production in a drastic sense. However, what they did was they did liberate the peasants to a certain extent and provided that force rather than religion became the basis of the state.
Delhi was the theatre where the state manifested itself most forcefully, and it was here that much of the action took place during what is known as the Delhi Sultanate.
Along with the Roman Empire, this is the only example where a long period of imperial system is not known so much by dynasties, but the locus of power, the capital, Delhi. And that name is Delhi Sultanate. The second thing is that Sultanate gives clearly the indication that this imperial system was not based on any ideology, not on any creed, not on any basic principles, but purely on naked brute force. The word Sultanate is derived, its origin is Sult, and the dictionary meaning of Sult is power.
Away from the seat of power, the peasant at the bottom of the heap continued to toil much as his forefathers had done in the centuries before Islam. The Persian wheel was one of the technological innovations of that period. But for the common man, the wheel of time turned much as it always had. Ancient beliefs and ways of life persisted. The remains of the Buddhist stupa over the ruins of Mohenjo-daro are a reminder of the pre-Islamic Buddhist presence in Sindh. In fact, the first Muslim raids in Sindh and elsewhere under Muhammad bin Qasim were made easier by the hostility between the Buddhist peasants and the Brahmins who'd overthrown Buddhist rule. After they had conquered Sindh, the aim of the Muslims was to secure an outlet to the sea via the Indus. This took 2 centuries to accomplish, not such a long period in a land where time takes its own monumental pace to become history.
History has many methods of inventing itself and reinventing itself, and monuments have many meanings. Sometimes these meanings are deliberate. Monuments are built and then rebuilt. On the other hand, many monuments have people just move into them and give meanings which are very different from the ones originally intended. Take the case of monuments associated with Mahmud Ghazni. Mahmud Ghazni raided India around 1000 AD, and it is well known that he went up to Somnath and destroyed the Somnath temple. Centuries after his time, the Somnath temple was rebuilt. It is not so well known that Mahmud Ghazni also destroyed a large number of Ismaili settlements and mosques on his way, suggesting in fact that his raids had more to do with plunder than with religion.
Mahmud Ghazni's raids are vivid in popular memory, but in reality they did not have a lasting effect. Later incursions by the Muslims were more significant. They tended to move into previously inhabited sites, as the recent archaeological findings at Lal Kot near Mehrauli show. Earlier, Prithviraj Chauhan is said to have ruled from the fort here. Later, Delhi was to have many incarnations here and elsewhere. At Karanya, Allahabad, the tale is still told of the bitter enmity between the chivalrous Prithviraj Chauhan and his unwilling father-in-law Jayachand.
और इसका ये है कि ये राजा जयचंद यहाँ रहता था और संयोक्ता के बारे में लड़ाई हुई, जिसके बारे में यहाँ मुसलमान आके इसके ऊपर काबू किए मोहम्मद गौरी ने। और जब उन्होंने काबू किया, वो काबू इस तरह किया कि वहाँ पर जाकर के ये संयोक्ता को जब ले गया पृथ्वीराज चौहान, जब वहाँ ले जाने के बाद में तो इन्होंने मुसलमानों को बुलवाया, पृथ्वीराज चौहान के ऊपर चढ़ाई करवाया, उनको तो शिकस्त दिया। फिर ये राजा कड़ा जयचंद के ऊपर भी उन लोगों ने चढ़ाई करके इनका भी काबू किया, इनका भी ख़त्म कर दिया। तो वो पृथ्वीराज चौहान यहाँ आए और आने के बाद में संयुक्ता को घोड़ा पे बैठा के ले गए। एक वही रिकॉर्ड है आज का कि कड़े की तौहीन उसी वक्त हुई।
It was Muhammad Ghori who consolidated Muslim rule by defeating the feudal Rajput rulers of North India. The various dynasties that followed Muhammad Ghori built upon that foundation. Qutbuddin Aibak, Ghori's slave as well as one of his generals, founded what is today called the Slave Dynasty. Qutbuddin began the construction of one of India's most recognizable monuments, the Qutub Minar at Delhi. It's not clear what its original purpose was, although it was evidently built with material taken from Hindu and Jain temples. The structure has intrigued visitors for centuries. Was it a symbol of the imperial aspirations of Qutbuddin and his successor Iltutmish? Did the mighty tower seek to convey the same message of imperial might as the nearby iron pillar had done for centuries? And what does it stand for today, when both space and time have acquired new dimensions? Situated within the labyrinths of what is now known as Old Delhi, this humble grave is just as eloquent, in its way, as the most flamboyant of the monuments of the Delhi Sultans. The grave is that of Razia Sultan, daughter of Iltutmish and the first woman ruler in India. Razia met a tragic end, a victim of patriarchy and of the palace intrigues which were an endemic feature of the Sultanate. This placid setting on the Gangetic Delta or Doab was the unlikely launching pad for one of the master intriguers of this period. Alauddin Khilji began somewhat humbly from Kara, where his life had been made most miserable by his nagging wife and mother-in-law. Possibly to escape them, he proceeded to Deogiri in the Deccan and conquered the formidable Yadava fort there. Returning north with the massive booty from his Deccan campaign, Alauddin plotted to kill his uncle, the king Jalaluddin. Jalaluddin met his untimely end in the waters of the Ganga at Kara. Alauddin then established himself as a ruthless ruler at Delhi. He took on the invading Mongol hordes from the fort he built at Siri. Today, its crumbling remains share the skyline of South Delhi with brash pretenders. At nearby house khas, children play in the shadow of a once sinister monument from the times of Alauddin Khilji.
The Chor Minar is a very interesting structure. It was built by Alauddin Khilji, possibly to strike terror in the hearts of thieves and perhaps even of the Mongols who raided Delhi. Their severed heads used to be stuck to poles, and the poles used to be stuck to the holes which are in the minar. This obviously put the fear of God, or at least the fear of the Sultan, into the heads of wrongdoers. Alauddin Khilji established an empire which was based more or less on the principles of the Arthashastra, which prescribed a centralized rule which would be carried out through the enforcement of very strict discipline in many spheres. One of the things which he carried out was price control. Alauddin used to send little boys from his court to various shopkeepers and ask them to buy things, to examine whether the shopkeepers had short-changed or short-weighed the goods. If it was found that the shopkeepers had short-weighed, then the soldiers used to be sent in order to cut off equivalent amounts of meat from the haunches of the shopkeepers. There were many cases of overweighing in Sultan Alauddin Khilji's time.
In a way, Alauddin tried to recreate the centralized empire that the Mauryas had built more than 1,500 years earlier.
This is the imperial phase. Almost the whole of India, right up to Madura, is brought under one single political system, which in the background of the political fragmentation and small petty states warring against each other is definitely a very significant step. The second thing is that this centralization also results in a different kind of thing, and that is that now the government goes down to the level of the villages, the countryside, and establishes authority. This is done through the revenue system. The entire revenue is collected through the intermediaries, no doubt about it. Then it goes back to the center, and from the center again it gets back in terms of commission on wages to the officers. So this I use always to compare the system in terms of an electric grid system. That earlier you have local powerhouses producing power to be consumed locally. Now what exactly happens is a person sitting in there is controlling the distribution, collection, generation. So that is where you find that in terms of the structure of the government, that is a very fundamental development. The other thing is bureaucracy. Paper, as you know, came into India very late with the Turks. And yet we find in the description that say parch, gram and small kind of things, snacks, shopkeepers were selling it wrapped in paper, which is astounding, which means this is the raddi. From the bureaucracy it is being disposed of and so much paper comes in. So this is another important thing, that where you find the records and officers and clerks and ummas and other people sitting down, jotting down notes and giving instructions, paperwork goes on.
Ironically, the bureaucracy in Alauddin's time provided the Sultan with an efficient system of revenue collection, which made the empire extremely prosperous. In a fashion similar to that of the Mauryas, Alauddin decreed that there was to be one rule for the payment of tribute. This became applicable to all, from the chieftains to the scavenger. The heaviest tribute was not to fall on the poorest. All cultivation was to be carried on by measurement at a certain rate for every unit. Half the produce was to be paid, and this rule was to apply without the slightest distinction. Another rule related to buffaloes, goats and other milk-giving animals. A tax for pasturing at a fixed rate was to be levied on every house, so that no animal, however so wretched, could escape the tax. Quite obviously, Alauddin did not go out of his way to court popularity. The revenue that Alauddin accumulated enabled him to begin the construction of a tower, the Alai Minar, which was to be so tall that it would dwarf the Qutub Minar. It remained unfinished and stands perhaps as an appropriate symbol of Alauddin's reign. The Tughlaks who followed the Khiljis also had a checkered history. The Tughlakabad Fort on the outskirts of Delhi is a reminder of the reign of Ghiasuddin Tughlak. His rule came as a welcome relief to the class of feudal landholders who had dreaded Alauddin's exactions. Alauddin had whipped the nobility into shape, but Ghiasuddin Tughlak once again tried to strengthen his hand by making concessions to the feudal aristocracy and the landholders. There's an interesting story about the construction of the Tughlakabad Fort. The saintly Sheikh Nizamuddin Auliya was in the middle of a project to provide people with a tank to collect rainwater when Sultan Ghiasuddin announced his plan to build the massive fort. All labourers working on private projects were ordered to report immediately to the king's works. The Sheikh requested the Sultan to spare a few men for his baoli, but was refused. Upon this, Nizamuddin is said to have cursed the fort, Ya rahe ujjar, ya base gujjar. It will either remain uninhabited or will be occupied by the wild Gujars. As it happens, the prophecy did come to pass.
When Ghiasuddin Tughlak was in Bengal, he was told that Sheikh Nizamuddin Auliya was questioning the king's authority. The Sultan decided to come to Delhi to punish Nizamuddin, at which point Nizamuddin is supposed to have said, Hanuz Dilli Durast, Delhi is still far away. What actually happened was that when the Sultan reached the borders of Delhi, his son, who later got to be known as Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlak, erected a massive welcome arch. And precisely at the moment when Papa Deer was under the arch but the son was not, the arch came collapsing down, killing the Sultan.
The reign of Ghiasuddin lasted only 5 years. The martial and arrogant Sultan lies buried in this tomb at Tughlakabad, and the fort to this day lies abandoned, overgrown and frequented only by Gujars and their herds. Ghiasuddin's son and successor was not just an inventive parricide.
Muhammad bin Tughlak did many other things, some of which were fairly significant. Every time you handle a currency note, for instance, think of Muhammad bin Tughlak. It was he who started token currency in India. Muhammad bin Tughlak did not like the fort Ghiasuddin had built, and he moved away from here all the way to Tughlakabad in the center of India. The reason was that he was afraid that the Mongols who were coming from down the hills and through the plains of Punjab would attack Delhi, which was fairly vulnerable. He wanted also to place the capital in an area which was central to the whole of India. Already the concept of India was emerging. The concept of India as one geographical entity which would have a center, and the center was the geographical center which Muhammad bin Tughlak chose.
The shifting of the capital to this fort at Deogiri, which Alauddin Khilji had conquered earlier, was perhaps the supreme act of imperial arrogance in this period. The entire population of Delhi was given just 3 days to make the move. The Tughlakabad Fort, as it was renamed, represents the state-of-the-art security measures of the period. But no amount of theoretically uncrossable moats, labyrinthine secret passages and mazes could prevent the fort from being repeatedly breached. Naturally, the method used was not brute force, but treachery and deceit. Tughlakabad fell and did so repeatedly.
It fell because precisely the nature of feudalism which sustained it was over elaborate. It did not have support of its peasantry, nor did it have such devotion among the courtiers that they would not betray it to the enemy.
Muhammad bin Tughlak's successor, Firoz Shah, built yet another Delhi and named its central fortress after himself. The Firoz Shah Kotla was the capital from which the new Sultan reinforced the feudal hierarchical order. Firoz Shah dug 2 canals from the Jamna and the Satluj, both via Karnal, into Delhi, and had many lesser waterworks built. He is also responsible for imposing the jizya poll tax on Hindus, thereby instigating religious discrimination, a feature that showed up time and again in India. Yet what this Muslim Sultan is best known for today is the care with which he transported 2 Ashokan pillars to Delhi. He had them re-erected there as symbols of imperial concern for the ancient and wondrous artifacts of Indian civilization. If Islam had taken firm roots in India by this time, it was not just due to the efforts of kings and soldiers. Among its greatest popularizers were the Sufis like Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti, whose dargah at Ajmer is venerated equally till today by Muslims and Hindus alike. What Sufism achieved was the synthesis of several strands of religious thought, and it sought to popularize this through the language of the common people. In India itself, several silsilas or traditions of Sufi thinking flourished. The most enduring was the Chishtiya silsila. The branches at Chisht near Herat have not survived, but the silsila founded by Khwaja Moinuddin in India flourishes until today. The Dargah of Sheikh Nizamuddin Auliya is a shrine dedicated to the most famous successor of Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti. Nizamuddin's teachings draw from Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist and Christian traditions. The most famous disciple of Nizamuddin Auliya was the great poet, musician, courtier and historian Amir Khusro. He is said to have invented the sitar, and in his verses he raised the status of the Hindu language, which drew from Sanskrit, Arabic and Persian. More than the sultans who came and went, it is Amir Khusro who best represents the period when India further evolved its composite culture. The relationship between the spiritual seers and the secular state reached its high point 2 centuries later under Akbar the Great, who built the Buland Darwaza at the feet of his Sufi mentor, Sheikh Salim Chishti.
Feet altitude, we're going to sort of go right up the valley and cross a pass at about 12,000 feet and get into the valley of Bada Bengal. It's about a 25-minute chopper journey, and you see some fantastic peaks as you get up there. You see some of the highest peaks in the Himalaya relatively close, and you're sort of flying in between them to get to this village. So it's a very exciting journey, and there's every chance of seeing ibex or snow leopard or martens or some other Himalayan wildlife in the middle of winter up on those cliffs as you're going through those gorges. Darjeeling, I'm excited about going back to Darjeeling and revisiting some of those tea gardens where I once collected butterflies and did my birding in my early years, and seeing what changes have taken place in those tea gardens 20 years hence, and still appreciating and looking at what bird life still exists over there. After all, the tea garden system of India is one of the finest conservation friendly industries in India. Tea gardens provide extensive areas of safe habitat for bird life, wildlife, butterflies, insects. They're like mini wildlife sanctuaries. So tea gardens are really good for the environment. And we'll look at some of those interesting birds and animals one finds in tea gardens. They have extensive butterfly life. You have excellent butterflies in the tea gardens for a collector or for a scientist. And we'll look at some of the bird life of the tea gardens, such as the jungle fowl and pheasants, and look for gurral, the wild mountain goat of the Himalaya, perhaps see some bear or some leopard, who knows, and look for some of the other interesting birds that one would find on a tea garden in Darjeeling.
And what about the remnants of the old English tea garden managers?
Well, tea garden life really hasn't changed a lot. The lifestyle of a tea garden manager is still quite the same as it was perhaps 50 or 100 years ago. And it's still a wonderful life. I think if I was not a wildlife filmmaker, perhaps I'd want to be a tea garden manager. But we'll go back and have a tea or a breakfast with one of the tea garden managers and see what life is like in the tea gardens, and spend some time, go for walks, see the factory, see how the tea industry is progressing. Things are not so good, but they're looking up, and we'll sort of put all that in perspective as we look for our birds and butterflies.
Okay.
We'll go back to Kanchenjunga, close to Kanchenjunga, into the state of Sikkim, and walk up to Zongri. And from Zongri one gets this most brilliant view of the eastern Himalaya, Kanchenjunga, Pandim, Narsing, all the peaks around Kanchenjunga. And we'll go during rhododendron flowering time. This would be in March and April. And you have several varieties of rhododendron flowering at the same time, and these are not just trees and shrub rhododendron, the arboreal varieties, but these are the dwarf rhododendrons, the really small shrubs and the sedges. And that will be really interesting looking at the dwarf rhododendrons flowering. You've got pinks, you've got purple, you've got mauve, you've got blue, you've got white, you've got yellow. Just about every color is represented in the eastern Himalayan rhododendrons. The entire western Himalaya is less than half a dozen species of rhododendron, whereas the eastern Himalaya has over 100 species. So we'll look at some of those species at the peak of their blooming. And rhododendrons are some of the finest flowers to be found in the Himalayas. So we'll examine Kanchenjunga, the Kanchenjunga National Park, and the rhododendrons.
And what about the life of the people? The life of the people who are around the Kanchenjunga National Park, who are being affected by a lot of ecological changes. They're planning to dam up the Rangit.
Yes, Kanchenjunga is subject to human pressures, as is just about every area in the Himalaya and in India. And there are few areas where you have true frontier country today. Everywhere, human beings tend to be putting pressure on the wild environment, on the habitat. And Kanchenjunga is facing its own fair share of problems. And you have the Hydel project that's coming up on one of the rivers there. And Kanchenjunga by itself has been one of the hunting grounds for a number of insect collectors and butterfly collectors from around the world. And a lot of people have been caught collecting insects and butterflies for export, which of course is completely illegal and banned in India. But there has been a clandestine trade in insects and butterflies from the eastern Himalaya. So the Kanchenjunga National Park authorities are clamping down on that. And just last year they found a scientist who was carrying into the forest with him a number of generators and lights to set up at night to attract insects and butterflies to collect them as specimens and export them from India. So the National Park management is looking into controlling that trade, and we'll see what they've done to sort of bring it under control and lessen and mitigate the effect of that
So will we
process.
go on the road with them?
Absolutely, we'll meet the forest department and see what they're up to and see what they're doing to bring about a change to this smuggling operation and how they're going to reduce that, how they plan to go about doing that. So yes, we'll see them in the field.
Okay. And finally, your Holy Grail, which is...
2, and now known only by virtue of 8 specimens, 6 of which exist at the Natural History Museum in London at their special collections in Tring, and which I strongly believe, and I'm perhaps the only person in this country who does, that the mountain quail still exists, and I'm going to find it one day. I've been looking for it for well over 15 years now, and I still head back to the habitat every year, sometimes for weeks or months on end, to look for the mountain quail. We've had people in the field with gun dogs trying to find the mountain quail in its last known habitat, and I still believe that one day, with enough work, we will go out there and find the mountain quail, and we'll be able to protect its habitat and protect a last viable breeding population of the mountain quail, so that we can sort of have the mountain quail join the ranks of the Jordan's courser and the forest spotted owlet, both of which were Indian species that were thought to be extinct, but which have been found over the last few decades. And I believe the mountain quail can join that group and be one of the long thought to be extinct species that actually gets rediscovered and comes back into the mainstream of as a Himalayan birding experience.
So what will this episode show the viewer?
We're going to go back into the last known habitat of the mountain quail, examine why the bird is thought to be extinct, why it perhaps has gone extinct, if it has at all, and why I believe it has not gone extinct. What are the reasons for it? We'll see some of the related species in its habitat, the other pheasants, the kalij, the chir, the koklas, the chokor partridge, the hill partridge, the piora, all the other related species, its habitat, the grasslands of Banog and Bhadraj, and around Nainital, Kilberry forests, and Jahanpanah and Jabarkhet and Mussoorie. We'll go back and see why the bird might have been thought to have gone extinct and why I believe it's not gone extinct, and what we're doing to actually try and discover it, to try and rediscover it, what steps we're taking, what scientific measures we're taking, the kind of people we're putting in the field, the scientific work, the ecological work we're doing, and how we're networking the villagers and the local shikaris, the local hunters, all in an effort to try and rediscover the mountain quail.
Okay, so finally, what do you expect, and who do you expect to interest with this series? Do you think it has people out there who would be interested in the series? Are there people out there who are waiting for something like this? Why do you think this information is important?
Well, I think it's about time for South Asian and Indian audiences to appreciate their own wildlife. I think all the other channels around us, be it National Geographic or Discovery, are feeding us a menu of programming that dates back to the 80s and 90s, and conveniently recycles old used programs on Africa and America and North America and Europe. And I think we are a little fed up of seeing the lions of the Serengeti yet again. And when we think of Indian wildlife, it's usually the tigers of Kanha or the tigers of Ranthambore. And I think there's a whole lot more to the Indian wilderness and to Indian wildlife than just the big cats or some of the more popular subjects. I want to bring you just that, the kind of stories and aspects of the Himalaya and the Indian wilderness that are not commonly seen or known, the hidden Himalaya essentially.
Okay, this is a pitch for BBC World. Can we have a pitch for National Geographic?
Okay, the kind of programming that one normally sees on National Geographic India, the South Asian feed of it at least, is very African, American, European centric, and I think it's really time that the National Geographic look at creating indigenous programming for a South Asian or an Indian audience or even a worldwide audience to try and bring India across as not just this land of tigers and elephants, but a whole lot of other interesting subjects and topics in the wilderness and the Himalaya, beyond Mount Everest perhaps, beyond the tigers of Kanha perhaps, and looking at some of the smaller cats, the 1200 species of birds that we have, and the hundreds of species of rhododendrons and orchids and primulas, all the fascinating flowers and birds of the Himalaya. And I think this is the program that would bring National Geographic into the mainstream, at least in terms of Indian viewers, and I'm sure it's going to have a larger universal global appeal to it, because this would bring India out in a sort of non-state and a very fresh perspective. It would bring all those hidden stories of the Himalayan wilderness that I've experienced, which I'd like to share with other people, and it would sort of, National Geographic would gain from bringing out a different aspect of India and bringing India across in a very fresh perspective.
Okay, let's have one more,
Okay.
in which be slightly more positive.
Okay.
Do not
Deride them.
criticize.
There's very little indigenous programming on India that one sees on global television channels, and most of the images one sees of the Himalaya are invariably related to something which I believe this program will help us do, because the Everest, we have to break some of those stereotypes which one generally tends to develop about a region. Like, for example, the Himalaya has got to be a whole lot more than Mount Everest, and Indian wildlife has got to be a whole lot more than the tigers of Kanha. And I want to bring out some of those mysteries and secrets which I've experienced in the Indian wilderness and the Himalaya. And I think there's a whole lot out there that would be of interest to global television audiences. We'd like to bring this out and put India and the South Asian region forward in a very fresh perspective for global audiences.
Okay, and can you just take a little patch of something which will come earlier? Can you say something like, I'm about to do a series called Hidden Himalaya, in which I shall take 6 journeys, and each of which is focused towards blah, blah, blah.
I'm about to undertake a series called Hidden Himalaya, under which we're going to undertake 6 very unique and special journeys into the Himalaya. And each of these will be visits back to places that I've been to in the past, and I'm going to see them in a fresh perspective, meet old friends as well as make new friends, visit new mountains, forests, look at the birds, animals and flowers, put them in the perspective of what I've seen or experienced in those areas before, and come out with secrets and new aspects to the Himalaya that have never been seen before on international television.
Take it once again?
Yeah, same thing,
Yeah,
okay.
Just take it as a chat. Okay, so Rupert,
Okay.
what's this new series, man? What you doing?
I'm going to make what am I saying? I'm going to tape? Okay, no.
Okay, yeah.
I'll be bringing you a